Thank you for being here. This is meant to be a lively, informal conversation. We have an incredibly accomplished panel. I'm going to give you some quick introductions, but let me first just remind you of our Charleston Library Conference Code of Conduct. Let's be professional, let's be kind, let's be inclusive. You know the rap. And we also need to stay focused on making sure that our session today is accessible. So a shout out to those who are joining us online. And all of our conversations, we're gonna have roving mics. So please join in the conversation. We wanna be sure to get all of the conversation recorded and clear for those who will be enjoying both online and in December as well. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm Letty Conrad. I am an independent researcher and consultant, currently serving a lot of my time these days as product experience architect with LibLinks. And I have with me the amazing Todd Carpenter, executive director of NISO, who's also involved in BISG and Force 11 and a gajillion other things. You have his bio. You can read up on the amazing things that he's done. Emily Gore is deputy university librarian at University of Georgia. She also is incredibly accomplished. I'm particularly interested in the digital preservation network work that you've done and the ways in which you've been involved in really the content, acquisitions and director positions at the various institutions that you've served. And Alice Meadows is co-founder of More Brains Cooperative, also former SSP president and winner of amazing awards for her contribution and service to scholarly communications. So thank you all three for being here. We have a couple of questions that we are prepared to pose to our panelists, but we're also really interested in your thoughts as well. So please have your questions and your contributions ready. We're going to spend just a few minutes on each question, and we hope you'll engage with us. So the first thing that we'd like to talk about is the role that policy and governance can play. What role should it play in facilitating changes in research infrastructure and in open research workflows in particular? And Alice, I wonder if you'd like to start with that one.
Sure, thank you. I am notoriously soft-spoken, so if I drift away from the mic, please wave your hands at me. So thanks, Nettie, thanks, Charleston, for having us here. So I guess what I would say first in answer to that question is any kind of policy, whether it's related to open research infrastructure or whatever, and particularly probably when it comes to mandates, is not a silver bullet. I think a lot of people think you have your policy in place and then that's it, you're all set. Well, thankfully, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but given what we've got coming along the pike here in the US, I think that is not the case. Policy alone is not going to, it may help drive change, but it's not going to mean that that change is necessarily implemented. I think to actually make change happen, you really need two things. First of all, you need to make it easy for people to comply. Anything that's not easy, anything that's clunky or difficult or requires them to move out of their existing workflow or space is going to meet with resistance. But I think equally important, you need to make it clear to them why they should comply. There needs to be a benefit for them, and ideally there needs to be a reasonably immediate benefit. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples taken from some of my own experience. One of my former positions was at Orchid, and when Orchid, I was there from 2015 to 2019-20, and people would often say to us, well, we just need to get funders to mandate Orchid or publishers to mandate Orchid. Everything, all your problems will be solved then. But actually, that is not the case, and we had a very clear example of this with when Orchid first started, before I joined actually, a number of institutions decided they wanted to go that path, and it was completely well intended, and at the time we thought it was a great thing that yes, they're going to require all their researchers to have an Orchid ID. The trouble was they went ahead, they assigned the Orchid IDs to their researchers, they told them about it, they sent them a letter saying, this is why we've given you one, here's your Orchid ID, make sure you use it, blah, 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 blah. But the researchers weren't consulted or engaged in those conversations. At that point, very few systems had ORCID integrated with them. So even if they'd wanted to use their ORCID ID, it was not an easy process. Even where there was integrations, they weren't that great integrations. And a lot of the time, they just forgot that they had their ORCID ID. So then what they did was they created a new one. And that led to a whole bunch of other problems. So mandates in that situation, that's an open research infrastructure example, really don't work. The second example I'd like to share is from the UKRI open access policy, which they developed, I think, in 2021. And there was a bit of an uproar. So UKRI is the UK, I'm going to blank what it's for, UK research funder anyway. And their open access policy created a bit of a furor, particularly in the UK, but also more widely, because obviously people publish in UK journals, not just UK researchers. And the fury was because there had been no consultation. UKRI had just decided this is what we want to happen. And actually, a lot of it was not possible, or it was going to be very, very difficult and potentially costly for vendors and others to implement. So they came to More Brains, my organisation, and said, is it true? Is the community just making a fuss about nothing, or actually are there problems here? So we were pretty sure that there were problems, but we went away and did the research and had the conversations and came back to them with a report that said, okay, these things, good to go. These things are easy to do. Everything's in place. Maybe minor adjustments needed, but basically good to go. These things, not easy to do, possible, but will require work. These things, frankly, impossible for the foreseeable future. So they said, ooh, well, maybe we better consult with the community after all. So we then went through with them a community engagement process. And as a result of that, they've now changed their guidelines and not the actual policy, but changed what they mean by compliance with the policy to better acknowledge that there are these gaps between what they ideally want to happen and what's actually achievable in the short term. So those are a couple of examples that hopefully demonstrate to you why I think policy needs to be part of the solution, but on its own can't be the whole solution.
I appreciate those examples in particular because it's hard to kind of take some of the abstract from policy and governance and actually make it applicable. Todd, Emily, anything you'd like to add? Any thoughts on specific guidelines or tools or structures that will help with compliance?
As someone who runs an organization that tries to get people to comply with things or come up with best practices,
You don't have any
I have no thoughts
No,
about
not
this
at all.
whatsoever. I've often said, in the area of best practices, in the area of policies, going through the process, writing it down, getting consensus on whatever policy or practice is actually the easy part. Building ORCID is it's not a snap your fingers kind of thing, but getting people to use it, getting people to adopt it, getting people to integrate it into their systems. I mean, this is the hardest thing with any standards or any best practice or any policy. There are few circumstances in our community where there is an entity that can say, you need to do this, and it's a mandate and it has to happen. There's very few, a lot of what we think of in this space are voluntary. No one is really forcing anyone to do any of these things. Hopefully there is a return on investment, there's a business case for doing something, there's a value added because of that. But you have to convince people of the value before they'll move towards implementation.
Now, the technology is the easy part relatively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Technology is, in the world of the work that I do, the technology is 10-15% of the problem. The 80% is getting people to the politics and getting people to use it.
Yeah, I'll just add, I'm going to talk about the Nelson Memo in just a second and kind of the impacts on the University of Georgia campus. But one of the things, I think policy is extremely important, and that's one of the things that we had to develop is research data policy at campus because we didn't have policy in place, including data ownership, et cetera. None of that was established, so we were a little behind the curve in that way. But I think that what we really had to think of was what was actually possible on our campus. There are lots of model policies at other institutions, which I certainly appreciate. Lots of guidance on how long you should keep data, all of that. But we had to consider what is realistic for our campus. So I think that that is extremely important. So our procedures, our policies are very streamlined, but our procedures are developed to change along, when, so the policy doesn't have to change so much and go through that process, but our procedures can be more nimble.
It's almost like there's three layers, right? There's the mandate or the policy, then there's the guidelines, generally how do you do it, and then you've got to adapt that to your community,
Our
to your
community,
institution. Yeah. Let's roll right from that actually to talk about how libraries are responding to the Nelson Memo and in particular infrastructure being put in place to prepare.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm gonna read just because of neurodivergence. So since the release of the Nelson Memo in August 2020, research universities, including mine, the University of Georgia, have been preparing to support our campus researchers' efforts to make publications and their supporting data resulting from federally funded research freely available and publicly accessible without embargo or delay after publication. Actions we have been taking at the University of Georgia include formation of a Research Data Advisory Council, charged by the Provost, VP for IT, and VP for Research, and administratively led by the university libraries. This council, comprised of faculty, researchers from across numerous disciplines, research IT, library administration, has focused on infrastructure and policy needs. We determined that both infrastructure and policy needed to move forward simultaneously instead of sequentially. As a result, we developed working groups to focus on each area. The products that are now unfolding include a 20 petabyte on-prem data storage system with a secondary cloud copy supported by research computing for research publications and data storage, a combined institutional and data repository utilizing the Invenio platform supported by the libraries, and a research data policy and set of procedures, as I mentioned, to kind of govern those campus research outputs. In the libraries, we added positions in a newly formed unit called Research and Computational Data Management. These positions assist with computational data research, research data management planning, and repository support, and a scholarly communication specialist to help UGA researchers and the library navigate contracts and copyright. We are considering joining the Data Curation Network, and we participated in the STAIR Summit this summer. And just as an FYI, if folks haven't seen it in the past couple of days, there's been a report released from that STAIRS Summit that you might want to take a look at. These considerations for us are important because our resources are limited, and we know that we need to be focusing on connections to the wider research ecosystem while also supporting our local researchers. I'll be honest in telling you that in the past week since the election, I've wondered if all these efforts actually still make sense. So if you've wondered the same thing about your commitments or efforts, know that you're not alone. The good news is that despite some initial skepticism, I do think these efforts make sense. Will the Nelson Memo be undone? Possibly. It is a memo and it's not an executive order, but still there is a likelihood that timelines and/or course of action could be reversed. It's hard to say with any certainty right now. What we do know is that NIH, arguably the leading US funder in support of open science, has issued its updated public access policy, and public comment on that policy ended several months back in August. We also know that the Department of Energy issued a public access plan in June of 2023. We know that other agencies have been working on their guidance, and based on information gathered by my colleagues at Spark, we anticipate somewhere between 25 and 26 more plans to be issued. Will that still happen? And will compliance with those policies still go into effect no later than December 31st, 2025? I think we all just have to wait and see what happens. On our campus, we have continued to negotiate or join transformative agreements that are largely cost neutral for us, and we have shifted some resources to things like Scope 3 and other subscribe to open models where possible. In many cases, we are signing contracts for shorter periods of time to give ourselves the ability to do more analysis of our title lists, to see where our authors are actually publishing, and to see how models are continuing to evolve. Our campus is adding a medical school over the next 2 years, and we are currently the top funded NIH public institution without a medical school. We have clear institutional goals to be invited to join AAU, to increase our international rankings. In the libraries, we've added resources to help research impact and intelligence, and we've conducted small studies within disciplines with a specific publisher that demonstrate the clear citation impact advantage of open for our authors. We aim to broaden those studies across disciplines and publishers as we continue to navigate the shifting landscape to help us be the best possible stewards of our library's resources. I'll end by saying this. I do think policy helps change practice. The Holdren Memo issued in 2013 has had an impact on current agency public access policies, and we have seen those policies continue to evolve over time. The Nelson Memo moves the needle even further. Whether it remains intact or not, I think there is an expectation, particularly in the sciences and social sciences on my campus, and likely on yours, to share publications and data openly, immediately, without embargo, and to use persistent identifiers. More shifts are needed in technology infrastructures, as my colleagues have mentioned, standards integration, and publication models. We've seen a lot happen in the past 11 years, and I think we can expect a lot more in the next 11.
That's so fascinating. And one thought that comes to mind as you're talking, Emily, is you're among this group, you're not a current chef in the Scholarly Kitchen, and I just want to encourage you to share your thoughts there. You are so eloquent and you are so clear in your delivery of thoughts, so thank you for that. I have one quick follow-up, if I may. You mentioned resources a couple of times, and I know that this is true for publishers as well. Both libraries and publishers adapting to respond to policy changes of all kinds, not just open access. In your experience, did that shift in resources, because you all are doing a lot, it sounds like, did that shift of resources mean rewriting jobs, putting people into sort of new roles? Was it new hires? What did it look like on the staffing level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're still in the middle of it, as I think many colleagues throughout the country are. So we had a number of retirements, so that allowed us to have some vacant positions, and so we filled those in different ways.
Okay.
We made some decisions to fill positions in different ways. So that we have not gotten any new positions. We have I mentioned our head of research and computational data management. That position was co-funded by our central IT, so that has certainly helped as well. So that kind of coming together of IT research and the libraries to support that infrastructure within the libraries has happened on our campus, which I think we're very lucky to have had that happen. And so that really helps that centered commitment, I think, by all partners.
Yeah, all
But
hands on deck.
all hands on deck, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alice, Todd, anything you'd like to add? This is a juicy topic.
I am just going to add something that cropped up. I had lunch with a couple of friends, and we were talking about this exact topic, in fact. And one of them, Jennifer Kemp, said something that really resonated with me, and I think builds on what you just said, Emily, which is, you know, if the worst happens and all this gets thrown out by the next administration, it doesn't mean it has to go away. We can still have policies that we believe in and we want to do our best to comply with and implement, even if it's not at the federal level. So I know it's kind of self-evident, but it cheered me up a bit to think of it that way. So
No, I think that's an important call to action, right? We don't necessarily have to wait for mandates to do the things that we know are right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Todd?
And this is a perfect segue into what I was going to talk about. Um, One of the elements of the Nelson Memo, it's kind of buried in there, but it's really important, has to do with access. And not access in the open paywall barriers perspective of access. It has to do with equity. And I've been thinking a lot recently about the Eisenhower matrix, which is important and urgent. There are a lot of things in our community that are important but not urgent, and they kind of end up 35th on the development pipeline. And like, yeah, we'll get around to that when we eventually get through the urgent things. But accessibility is a critical feature here of providing access. And again, it kind of gets to, this is still the right thing to do. And even if the Nelson Memo and the Holdren Memo are withdrawn, there are other important things taking place in the community with regard to access and the provision of access in the next 18 months. The European Accessibility Act comes into full force, and content providers are providing content to a worldwide audience, so they need to comply with the European Accessibility Act. There's also Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provides for any public entity that is providing content or services has to adhere to the accessibility requirements in order to serve the populace. So those two things over the next 18 months are going to drive a need for more attention to issues around accessibility. And that is regardless of what happens with OSTP. The OSTP has done a lot of really interesting and useful convenings over the last year to bring people together to talk about issues around accessibility as it relates to the scholarly record and the content that is being distributed. There's some really interesting studies over the last couple months that are focused on accessibility and the problems in the scholarly record when it comes to accessibility. There was a research paper that the Lancet published on image alt text. So these are embedded metadata that describes images in digital form. Only 3 of the several thousand articles that they looked at, or several hundred articles that they looked at, had appropriate, useful alt text. A lot of people are putting figure 1 or 31742 image.jpg, which is worse than useless. And the number of images that had that was in the 40–50% range, which is a big problem. There was also just recently an ACM conference focused on accessibility, where some researchers at Washington did a longitudinal study of the accessibility of PDFs over the past 10 years. And they looked at 20,000 articles, and only 3% of those PDFs were completely compliant when it comes to accessibility. 3%. And they also found that over that 10-year period, the accessibility functionality has decreased, which is incredibly problematic.
The wrong direction.
And
Go in the wrong direction.
go in the wrong direction. And they pointed to open access as a possible feature here, because if you're reducing the publication costs, you have less resources, you want to get it out the door faster, you kind of skip over some of these important aspects of publishing. I've said for years, publishing isn't just throwing things up on the web. And unfortunately, that's what we're doing. And things like accessibility are falling by the wayside, and that is a real problem. There are, according to the United Nations, 1 billion people with a B who have some form of visual and reading disability or reading impairment. Right? This is not a small market. This is not a niche problem. This affects literally 1 billion people. And we can do better.
So, Todd, is open access enough, do you think, for publishers to comply with these impending changes to US and EU accessibility mandates?
No, it's not, because it needs to be accessible. And by accessible, that means more than just doesn't have paywalls. And this is going to apply to publishers. But if you are hosting a repository where you have your preprints at your institution, these rules apply to you too.
Emily, I'm curious about your thoughts here, in particular, because as I understand it, the EU mandates and the US mandates are a little bit different as far as kind of who they hold responsible, where the American Disabilities Act is more looking at providers, right? Universities, libraries, and the EAA is looking more, publishers are in the crosshairs there. So thoughts on how your institution is looking at compliance?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Well, I'll just say that we're in the middle. We're part of a broader digital library that we host. It's called the Digital Library of Georgia, that we've had for a number of years with our partners, Galileo, our statewide consortium, and we are in the middle of a DOJ inquiry on web accessibility. So we've been responding to that and addressing a number of these issues, including things like captioning for videos and things like that, that in many years we have neglected, or we captured them early on and they've been online for 20 years without captions, and we have to go back because they are retrospectively need to be done when they're not involved in the current practice. Currently, we're doing that as part of best practice. So I think there's so much to accessibility, but as well, before I came to the University of Georgia, I worked at the University of Tennessee libraries, and I'll just give a shout out to those folks, where they actually created a position at the University of Tennessee libraries to simply evaluate the accessibility with vendors. They have a state law as in addition to the federal law around accessibility. Not every state does, but the state of Tennessee does. And the University of Tennessee took that compliance very much to heart. So in the libraries, there's a checklist for vendors, and definitely kind of work towards that accessibility, that compliance that goes on, and a back and forth. And they were able to devote a full-time position in the libraries to that. So I will say that I would hold them up as an example of an institution.
Their response. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think really gets to that collaborative nature, right? And kind of brings us back to the first question around, the role of policy. And I've been negligent in asking you all if there are questions. We've been talking a lot about how either open access or accessibility mandates put onus on both publishers and libraries. So thoughts from the audience? Yeah, Simon.
She's got the mic.
Do we have we need a mic, yeah.
We have a roving mic. There's a question back there and one down front.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I missed that one in the back. Well, you're next. And online questions too. If anybody's monitoring those, do shout out. Oh, okay.
Not live.
Apologies. My bad. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Simon Holt. I lead content accessibility efforts at the science publisher Elsevier. Thanks very much. It's great to see all the coverage of accessibility on this panel, especially in the context of policy. I guess my question to the panel, thinking about what Alice said about how policies need to be easy to achieve, they need to have a immediate benefit, and also they need to speak to priorities. I've always thought that change happens one conversation at a time, and I'd be interested in thinking about how the panelists think that we continue to enact positive change and have those conversations at a broad level in what is likely to be a rather more hostile policy environment than we've experienced for several years.
Thanks, Simon. Well, I guess I will revert to saying, I think for me anyway, and maybe others feel this way, things that you can do at an individual level at a time like this are super important, whether that's the individual conversations, as you say, or remembering to add meaningful alt text, or, having slides that are actually easy to read for somebody who's red, green, colour impaired or dyslexic or whatever. So I know it's kind of little, but to your point, I think that is how change is made. And in a probably very Pollyanna-ish way, I wonder whether this could be a really good time for some of that sort of drip, drip, drip change to happen, because we're all, I think, many of us anyway, are going to be looking for ways to make a difference in small ways. So I know that's a very maybe naive way of looking at it, but that's what I hope to do myself, and I hope others will too.
Yeah, one step at a time, right?
And to your point, Simon, thank you. A lot of what we're talking about here is already baked into these systems. The technology is already there. It's getting people to understand why it's important and how to use it. You don't need to redo your systems. Every publisher can publish to PDF. You just need to publish in the right way. These tools already exist. There are guidance, there's whole swaths of research and guidance on how to do this. I'm interested in exploring some of the issues here might just be errors in production, because I've looked at some of the back end, and some of the alt text is there, it just doesn't get rendered into the PDF. And that's probably just some fault in the production process that no one's actually checking. And visibility and talking about this and calling out organizations for, I mentioned in an article in this kitchen about manuscript tracking software. People don't like getting called out for not being as good as they could be. But what we're trying to do is not shame them. We're trying to get them to recognize the value and the importance and how do you move forward. And I think we don't need policy necessarily to do that. Policy helps. It's shining a light and visibility.
Anything to add? Okay, let's take that second question in the back. Thanks for your patience.
Hi, Michelle Avasar-Whiting from HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Todd, I'm going to pick on you. You made a point, or you mentioned that some have pointed to open access as being part of the issue here with the deficit in metadata, or specifically alt text on images. Is there any actual empirical evidence to support that there's less, or
that was a research report published by ACM at a conference just last month that looked at those. That was not my opinion. That was a conclusion of those researchers at the University of Washington. I'm happy to send you the paper. I don't necessarily think that open access is the cause, but it also diminishes the resources that the entire ecosystem has, and that has an impact. That has an impact. Whether you can point to open access and reductions in the amount of money in the ecosystem, therefore leads to that, I think is a bit more of a stretch. But that was their conclusion, not mine.
I would love to see that report.
Sure.
We need a citation method for our conversation.
Yes.
We have a few more minutes. Are there other comments from the audience?